This episode is going to be a little different because this is the first time, first of all, that I've had a founder on the show who has an operations focus. And the first time I've had a founder on the show who's had successful IPO. Miranda Lievers is my guest today, co-founder and former COO of Thinkific. And Miranda, I always start by asking my guests to tell the story of how we met. And I sent you these questions and you said you couldn't remember. Is that?
I remember like the general time that we met, but I'm looking to you to fill in the blanks.
That's saying something because I was thinking about it and I think it's in the neighborhood of about 18 years ago.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
No small amount of years. I'm relatively certain that I met yourself and Riley on a photo walk through Gastown. And we went to, I'm trying to remember the name of the small pub. We sat outside a small pub afterwards. Not the Alibi Room, maybe?
Like Lamplighter, somewhere in Gastown there.
Across from Lamplighter, right adjacent to Gassy Jack, or where Gassy Jack used to stand. Is he there anymore? Did we pull him down? I can't.
I don't know.
I don't go to Gastown nearly as often. I used to be there every day of my life. Now, a little less often. But there you have it, about roughly 18 years ago on a photo walk. And I think that's funny because that was a time when the social web was kind of in its infancy, and that's what we all had in common.
Yeah. It's that was a long time ago. The world was a different place.
We were so wide-eyed and naive, and it was a different time. By way of introduction, you took a startup to a $1 billion IPO. That's $1 billion Canadian dollars, right?
Yeah, like $1.3 billion on closing day. I think it was wild. Yeah.
So that's with exchange. That's billion either way. It's unicorn or it's narwhal, depending on how you look at it. And most of the people watching or listening to this show only dream of that kind of a result. So I think my first question has to be an obvious one. What's that like?
Yeah, it's a wild milestone. Like, as you said, it's like the kind of thing that like most of us could only ever dream of, myself included. And in many ways it sort of feels surreal, but then also like forgive me for saying this, but it doesn't change all that much. Like, I love when I think back to the experience, like I love the heads down, crazy amount of work in the 5 months leading up to our IPO and all of the things we learned and did. And, and that whole journey, because that was new and something, we hadn't done before. And I certainly hadn't done before, but like many milestones that we set for ourselves, you hit the goal, and the next day is just a normal day. Like the day after we started trading, it's like you kind of just like wake up and you're like, oh wait, like I don't have meetings, I don't have a bunch of deliverables, like I don't have like a bunch of stuff that I need to hustle in order to pull this IPO across the line. And you kind of just roll up your sleeves and say, okay, what do I do around here again? Like, right, this business, we're running this business. And in so many ways, like for me, it was all about that experience of leading up to it, because once you've hit that bell, literally, it becomes just another day, and then you just keep marching forward. So in some ways, it's anticlimactic.
Did yourself or one of your co-founders or teammates actually ring the bell at the TSX then?
It was all virtual because it was in the middle of COVID. So we actually did. It was probably like it was one of the only times in history, or the only time in history that IPOs have been run virtually. And so it was all virtual.
That's I feel like we could have an entire episode in itself of just it's like you were the perfect COVID business really as well. I know this isn't a scripted question, but I am or at least was for the bulk of the pandemic, was a Thinkific customer and selling training. Maybe let's talk about Thinkific for a second and just tell us what it's about, and we'll talk more about the product market fit stuff
Yeah.
in a bit, but just explain what Thinkific is and why someone like me would be a customer.
Absolutely. So Thinkific is a platform that makes it simple for people, businesses, speakers, authors, coaches, etc., to create and deliver courses and other education products online. And yes, being in a business that enables people to take their offline business models online when a pandemic hits is certainly not a bad place to be. And we saw a tremendous acceleration of our growth through that period as a result of that.
Yes, but I think it's fair to say that you had achieved a good deal of traction in advance of that. You'd had several funding rounds.
Yes.
Take me back to the time when, I guess, when you matured from what I would consider an early stage startup, and I guess maybe when you found product market fit. What was
Mm.
that like?
Yeah, good questions. I think it's interesting thinking back over the journey because, like any good overnight success story, it's 10 years or more of
Right.
just
Yeah.
heads down work where occasionally you sort of look up, look around and go, is this working? Okay, well, it sort of seems like this is working. Let's just keep going. But for me, one of the moments that I distinctly remember burning to my brain on that product market fit exploration journey was the first time that I was looking at data, and I was always pulling reports and looking at data and trying to understand what customers did we have and what were they doing and what was happening. And I remember the very first time that I pulled a report and a customer that I didn't recognize had made money on our platform, and I was like, oh, this is weird. Like I didn't like who's this? Like I didn't talk to these folks. Like I didn't help these guys. Who did? And I got a bunch of blank stares from my co-founders, and we determined and we checked like the email logs and everything. It's like, wait, like nobody's talked to this person and they just found us, signed up, created a site, and then sold something like without our like without
Right.
our manual help. And that was like such a moment of like, whoa, like because up until then it was so much heavy lifting, and even when we had software we were still working with people one-on-one to like help them upload stuff and help them get
Right.
going and giving them advice. And that was that first moment where it's like someone got value from what we've created without having to talk to us, which means that that was that moment where it's like that we're we really are hitting and starting to hit like that product market fit, and now we can scale, and it grew quite quickly
Very
from there.
cool. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but
Mhm.
presumably you would have had an onboarding process in place, and so they just navigated through, and I guess the infrastructure was there so that that could happen.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
just that that's the first time that nobody reached out. They didn't reach out.
yeah. I mean, and because you build all of that iteratively over time, right? It's like, oh, okay, like people keep asking this question. Well, I guess we should have a knowledge base. Where does that go? Oh, we, like this is what people need to do first. Let's introduce, the first marketing automation emails so that we're in control of what we're spoon feeding to them. And yeah, so it's like you build those things and you add those things iteratively over time, but it was still surprising when somebody got going without needing to talk to us for more.
Right on. And then presumably that opened the floodgates and it
Snowballed.
started happening more often.
Yeah.
And then those people just started becoming more data points along the way.
Yeah.
How, as a COO, and this is a marketing podcast, so
Yeah.
but I guess in the grander sense, it's a growth podcast for founders, and this is just the most amazing growth story. Have I thanked you already for coming on the show?
This is fun. I said this is so fun. So
Yeah,
thanks for
yeah,
having me.
I'm having a great time, but I'm immensely grateful. How involved is a COO in marketing and customer acquisition?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that my hat was probably more co-founder throughout the whole thing than what like it's like what does a normal COO do? I don't know. But CEO was taken, so COO is the hat that I wore. But certainly marketing, especially early on, marketing was like a very large part of what my co-founder, so Greg Smith, our CEO, and I were spending a lot of time on marketing because, we were building software, yes, and our team was building software, yes, but then the whole other side of that is, well, how do we get this into the hands of people, and how do we figure out what's working so we can do more of that, and how do we, get folks to the point where they're getting value from what we're building. So everything was
Right.
marketing.
I think in my case, I probably heard about your successful funding rounds because, locally we celebrate that kind of thing when one of our own hits it big or hits a milestone, we should say. But I'm curious to know what were the key drivers of growth. Particularly, let's talk about the early stage stuff.
Yeah.
So when you were first worried about how do we get this into those people's hands, what kind of tactics were you doing?
Yeah, great question. We started throwing a lot of, spaghetti at the wall like we all do. And, but really thinking back, the biggest, it's sort of like, it's a couple things. I mean, ultimately it was relationships and word of mouth, but we drove that entirely by webinars. Like, so early on, we sort of figured out that loop of, hey, we've got somebody that has used our product and is getting some value, and hey, it looks like their audience is the kind of, includes a number of folks that might actually be interested in what we're doing, and let's connect with them and figure out ways that we can give to them in the hopes that they invite us to come and speak to their audience, which we were able to close that loop, and then we'd get them talking about us to their audience in sort of a webinar kind of format. Was really our biggest growth loop for a long time. And just, instead of creating case studies that people would kind of come and find anonymously, people were often hearing about us from people they already knew and respected that used us. And we were there to support that conversation.
Do you want to name drop somebody? Is there an example of
I
somebody that
don't like
you
name drop. Like, it's like, because it was big people and it was small people. Like, it's like we had,
sure?
like there was like the Lewis Howes of the world or the Marshawn Evans of the world, and some of these, people who are sort of like a big deal in their small circles, like, so if you don't recognize those names, but I
I
mean,
don't.
folks who, yeah, like folks who had their own followings and were in a position to speak about us to the people that they were speaking to. And often in those sort of like build business and grow business online sort of spaces. But
Mhm.
we didn't discriminate on size. We were small and scrappy ourselves. And so that meant that if somebody had a tiny audience, we were still ready, willing, and able to show up. And what was interesting is, we learned over time that, the size doesn't matter so much, like, because you would get somebody that had like arguably a very tiny audience, but a very dedicated, and with audience with high engagement. And that could be just as beneficial for us as somebody that had, tens of thousands of people.
When that growth started accelerating, how did your customer acquisition strategies change, if at all? I guess I know that if you had the webinar thing working, then you'd probably be like, okay, this is working. What
Yeah,
else do we add?
yeah, good question. It's interesting because like hindsight, of course, being 2020, because you can kind of look back and you can see all the things that were working and why, and you can also see all the ways that you screwed that up and
I
why
want to hear about them all.
you didn't figure it out at the same time. And I think that and it also relates to as how we grew. And so one of the things that I'm fascinated by is systems thinking, and just the recognition that despite the fact that we like to divide our companies into silos, nothing ever happens in a silo, and it's all connected. And so some of the other pieces that were really integral to our customer acquisition strategy were actually like it was around customer success and like that whole onboarding process, and making sure that our customers really felt like we were a partner to their business. When we were very small, we were the ones doing it all. So it's like, the customer support emails were coming from me and Greg and and Matt, who's our CTO at the time. We were all doing customer support emails at 2 o'clock in the morning, and doing the marketing during the day, and, building the
Mhm.
software. But it meant that when people did sign up, we were asking them about their business, asking them about their goals. We were digging in to help them with things that frankly had nothing to do with our software, just because we wanted them to feel seen and heard and appreciated in a world where, as small businesses, we're often ignored by the partners that we're trying, the software products that we're trying to engage with, because, we're small fish, and we never wanted our customers to feel like that. But that meant that even early on, when our software was, like barely functional out of the gate, people had such a strong and positive experience in working with us that they became fans. And that was really important, right? So that, you can kind of gloss over a lot of the like, oh, that's glitchy, or we'll figure that out, or you have to talk to us for that. We don't have a feature for that yet. But we were able to close that loop. And I mentioned, sort of this webinar strategy, but what we ended up kind of doing, and again, it's easier said in hindsight, but basically what we ended up doing is we started to identify who we wanted to get in front of and do webinars with once we sort of exhausted the like handful of interesting names that were already using our platform. And so then we, would build the list of like who we want. And then what we would do is we would name drop them a bunch in things like blog posts where we would quote stuff that they had said elsewhere, even though they hadn't said it to us, but like we would quote them or we would write blog posts about them so that we knew that they were starting to get like the Google alerts or whatever they had going with their name and us. And so we would just give and give and give and give and
Warm
give
them up.
and give and give to get on folks' radar. And we would do things like, we would invite them to come, let them know we wanted to interview them a little bit like we are now. We would put that up on YouTube. Our audience wasn't that big. So even when we sent our whole audience there, the view count wouldn't go that high. So we would run paid ads to the videos to bring them more traffic and also like to just, make sure that it seemed a little more worth their while because our audience at that time was small. And when you give and give and give, fully from a place of just delivering value, then folks, would say, oh my gosh, like this has been so great. I'd love to introduce you to my audience and then bring us in front of theirs. And one of the things that was interesting is that as we grew, and instead of having, a couple of us that were sort of doing all of those things, and eventually now you've got a marketing person, and then now, and not just a marketing person, now we've got a blog person and a paid ads person and a webinar person, and these aren't the same people. And over time, that playbook, which is sort of like all of these disparate parts that actually needed to work together to keep this engine running, broke down because, eventually, like the person who's writing blogs is like, I don't understand why we keep quoting all of these people that aren't yet our customers. I'd rather write stories about the success our existing customers are having. And so then they stopped, doing a lot of this like early reach out stuff. And then our paid ads people would be like, why do we keep running all of these, ads to all of these videos that we keep producing when they just don't convert that well? So then they would just like, stop running so many ads because we hadn't done a good job of really connecting the dots for those folks to understand
It made sense to your original team and it didn't
because they had
necessarily
all the
trickle down.
context.
Right. Yeah.
And so over time, some of those early systems that could have had legs for a lot longer actually broke down because we didn't do a good job of really making sure everyone understood how those parts fit together.
These days, that would be an SOP in a Notion document or something where it's like, do not deviate from this exact plan because it works for these reasons.
Yeah. And when you're bigger, you can write documents that have a lifespan that lasts longer than a week and a half. But when you're that small, even when we tried to document anything, it's like things were just changing so fast that it was impossible.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the depth of the marketing team. You got a marketing person, webinar person, et cetera. I have a question here just asking about, adding depth in terms of management. Presumably when you raise a round of funding, now you've got the means to add executives, et cetera. I just, particularly as a operations person, I just want you to help us understand what is it like to do that, to add that depth, to add layers to your org chart, if you like, and in what sequence do you go about doing that?
It's messy and avoid it as long as possible. It's like, frankly, for us, the rounds that we had raised early on were actually quite small. Up until the point of IPO, we only put $6 million of primary capital into the business, which is quite.
Is that a reflection of the? I want to ask this question. Yeah. Is that a reflection of the being a Canadian startup? Or
no,
was it a choice?
We didn't need it. Like, it's like we didn't, we were quite intentional that we didn't want to take in more than we needed. We were fairly bootstrapped early on. We did a lot, we did services work in order to afford what we were doing early on rather than going out and giving up a ton of equity to raise.
Terrific lessons here, by the way. I hope people are paying attention. I don't mean to interrupt.
No, by all means. And, it was important to us that we weren't taking in capital that we couldn't immediately deploy. And we were able to experience a growth rate that allowed us to not need to bring in capital to grow until we intentionally later did. And so I would say that we stayed quite lean up until the beginning of the pandemic. We started the pandemic at 115 people, just to kind of give an idea of like numbers. At the beginning of 2015, we were still 4 people. So it's like, so 4 people at the beginning of 2015. And then 2020, we were a team of 115. And that actually ballooned up to 500 in spring of 21, or 22.
Okay.
Spring of 22 is when we hit
Top,
500.
top of your head, 115. What's the breakdown of product people,
Mm.
business people?
Yeah, probably a third, a third, a third. So probably a third in product and R&D, a third in marketing, and then the remaining third customer success, ops, sort of all the rest of it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. If there was something you were going to
No, I
say.
was just going to say, because you'd asked about executives, and I didn't talk about executives other than I don't like executives and I don't like executive titles. But I
Says
think
the chief operations officer.
I know I was named one of the top executives in the country last year, and I don't
And
like
you're like,
telling people
ah.
because I'm actually like I'm quite disgusted. Like I really don't like the word executive. Like don't call me an executive. I think that the last thing that we need in our growing companies are people that whose jobs are to push paper or tell other people what to do. And what we need much longer than we think we do are scrappy builders who can focus on an area of the company and figure out how do we do this, how do we do this here, how do we do this better, how do we iterate on this, and how do we figure out how we turn this into an advantage for us rather than just trying to run the playbooks that everybody else is running. So
Is there a moment in time though where you go from pursuing scrappy builder types to pursuing suits?
yeah, good question. So it's like people keep asking me what I'm doing now. So I'm like, I need to write a book at some point, and my book, when I do write it, will be in part about this because we have this like everybody has this idea that like, oh, you get to be builder and scrappy when you're small and move fast and break things, and then you need to grow up at some point and not be that anymore. When the reality is that it's like it's both. So early on, yes, like early on, 100%. If you think about the energy in the company early on is 100% in 0 to 1 builder scrappy because we haven't figured anything out and we're trying to figure out how we do things here. And then wearing my operations hat, eventually you start to figure out it's like, oh, this system is kind of working. Let's create a playbook for that. Now let's get somebody to run this, like even like I said, like this webinar loop that we've got going, and make sure, yes, we're going to continue to iterate on it, but we really just need to keep it running so that it creates ongoing success for us. And so I sort of view it as like we're stacking success over time. We're figuring stuff out for the first time. Now we're going to turn that into a thing and it's going to run. Then we're going to figure out how we hire people around here. Now we're going to turn that into a thing and it's going to run. Now we're going to figure out this and it's going to turn into a thing and run. And what it means is at the beginning, 100% of the energy of the company is builder, founder startup, but over time an increasing percentage of the company's energy is going into this like operating, like how it's like we build and then we operate, we build and then we operate. But if you were to graph it, it's sort of like it's like a triangle. Like at the beginning it's all builder, and over time it's like a greater and greater percentage of operating energy, but you still need the builder energy there to figure out what are we layering on top, what is the next new thing, how are we innovating, how are we building that next layer. And where we error often in growing and trying to scale companies is we think about it as like it's one or the other, and you need to do both. And it means you need to have both motions in your company. You need to have both energies in your company. You need to hire people for one or the other. And you need to have language that allows you to understand how to think about each of those motions. And it's entirely different, like how you resource them, who you resource them with, how you measure ROI, how you set goals and evaluate progress. All of that is very, very different for those builder motions and those operating motions. And when we sort of decide it's like, oh, like no more builder, no more scrappy, everything needs to be this operating motion. If you switch it, first of all, you make all your original builders sad and they're all going to leave. But that's also what will kill your company, because now you can only ever grow linearly from established sort of operating motions that are just incrementally improving over time. You can only ever build linearly. And so you need to continue to foster places in your company that have that startup hustle energy, but you need to balance it with this operator motion. And so it's like a little bit like patting your head while rubbing your tummy, and it's tricky to do.
What an excellent answer. That was great. I sometimes I like to just shout out to my podcast editor Sammy and say, Sammy, clip that whole thing. Make the it's a nice, good, long answer, but it's exactly the kind of thing that I hope founders are tuning in to learn in this episode in particular. Let's dig a little deeper into the operations side of things.
Yeah.
I help clients sell software, and often we are selling into, or at least we have to nod in the direction of an operations person. And there's operations people in virtually every department now: marketing ops, rev ops, dev ops, legal ops. I've sold into all of those. Who supports the operations chief? Is there an ops for ops?
Yeah, good question. I think like there's always like, it's like, well, how did we do it and how did it evolve over time versus like how maybe you would intentionally do it. The evolution for us was a little bit, like all things, a little bit organic, a little bit messy. So some of those folks reported into me and some of them did not. And some of them should have, or did at different times. We tended to be quite matrix. And so at one point, something that was quite effective was we introduced sort of like a guild of ops people. So even if those ops people were reporting into departmental leaders, we had sort of a time where everybody was coming together and could still learn and understand and just like not reinvent the wheel cross-functionally. But for me, and for my own very special blend of, what do I like to be close to, I had a chief of staff that was really great, and she was able to support by making sure that she was deep enough into each of those different groups that she could surface what needed to be surfaced. And my data people, as I mentioned, I was deep in the data always when we were very small, and that continued through the history of the company, which is, even once we had, FP&A and analysts and all sorts of people whose job was data, I found that was always the best way for me to get insight on like, how are things actually going and where are the opportunities and what should we be focused on? Because my job was never about, sort of like the nuts and bolts of figuring out how we're going to run processes and systems, et cetera, because we had, deeper folks closer to the work that could do that. But I was more interested in how do we tie the work that we're doing to strategy and making sure that we're staying one step ahead.
All right. You're using the past tense when you're talking about that. You, in the summer, you stepped away from the 9 to 5.
I did.
You're on sabbatical. That's one of the main reasons why I'm so enthusiastic that you agreed to be here, because you could just be on a beach. In fact,
beaches are really boring, Jordan.
But hey, well, what's it? Black Rock City? Is that what it's called? You
Yes.
just returned from Burning Man, and presumably that wasn't boring. I mean, it didn't sound boring. Less so this year than ever. But I guess that's an example of how you're spending your time. But what does a founder who's had a successful exit and is now, I don't want to say semi-retired, because I know that my next question is going to be what happens next, but how are you filling your days besides, appearing on friends' podcasts?
Yeah, good question. So I figured out that the last time that I didn't have one or more side hustles on the go was probably when I was 14. And so it's effectively something that I've never had time for. And stepping away from Thinkific, it was actually in the spring, I sort of made the decision that like I just wasn't going to dive into anything else yet. And I needed to put a whole bunch of rules around it for myself, where it was like no board seats, like no ongoing consulting arrangements, no, because it'd be so easy.
I remember seeing that post and I was like, yeah, but look me up when you I want to hitch onto your shooting star if I can.
But it would just be so easy to fill your time and be busy without actually being intentional. And so I really wanted to create space. And I would say that I've overachieved at creating space in all of the right ways. So I've enjoyed my summer. I've been really off grid. I've camped. I've been to Burning Man. I've enjoyed time with my kids. I've, had lots of insightful experiences and conversations with folks along the way. just, getting to know and remember even who am I in the absence of all of these different roles and labels and all of that good stuff. And I think that everyone should find space. I know we all can't take sabbaticals. Burning Man is a great way to go and create space for
If
those
you're just
kinds
going
of
to do a short
insights
one,
if
yeah.
you only have a week or 10 days. But yeah, so that's kind of what I've been up to. For me, what has always been true, long before Thinkific and will be true long after, is that I am inspired and in awe of people who are passionate about what they do. And it happens to be that I love and understand business. And the fact that I can take my love and understanding of business and help people take what they're passionate about and turn it into good for them and for the world, that just is everything to me. So I have remained somewhat connected with great, inspiring conversations with folks. And I love conversations like this because I think that small business and entrepreneurship makes the world go round. And the more that I get to, get connected to and hear the stories and have a voice into some of those small businesses, the better I am. So
You
there you go.
certainly ended up in the right spot to do that because that's Thinkific's customer base, right? When do you switch gears from sabbatical mode to intentionally filling your calendar with things again? Or I guess you decide the sabbatical is coming to an end and that you're intentionally looking towards the next thing.
Yeah, good question. Technically now-ish, but I'm not fully in my head yet. So I kept
It's
saying
still summertime outside.
well, yeah, I know, like, because I was kind of like, oh, it's September, like when my kids go back to school, and like when it's September.
Right.
But then I went to Burning Man, and then anyways, and I was just in Toronto. I just flew back home last night from Toronto. I was speaking to 167 girls interested in STEM careers, so high school girls. That
Nice.
was really fun. But yeah, so like I don't maybe next week I'll spend more time in front of my computer,
There's
but
no rush
I'm
to
not.
kick into it.
I'm not going to stress about it.
Sun is still shining. It's I feel like I should ask about it because I think maybe the media represented things one way and people that were there saw it a different way. Can you just tell us a little bit about what happened at Burning Man?
Yeah, the TLDR is that anybody that thought that they were going to Coachella was sad, and anybody that knew that they were going to Burning Man was just fine and totally prepared and took care of all of the sad, like, sparkle ponies who thought that they were at Coachella.
Fair
Um,
enough. Fair
yeah,
enough.
the reality was,
Rainstorms and
yeah,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, like, it's Burning Man. The whole idea is that it's a city that is built in one of the most inhospitable places on the planet, and you come fully and completely prepared and able to tackle whatever life can throw at you. We know that it can be freezing temperatures overnight. We know that it is literally a dried lake bed, which means that it can turn into a lake, which it did. The primary mode of transportation is bicycle. So that was totally off the table. It meant that people needed to stay close to their camps. You needed to stay close to your neighborhood. And the mud is not mud, it's clay. So when you saw those crazy pictures of people with like plastic bags on their feet, it's not because they didn't have good footwear. It's because that actually was a way to minimize how much clay would stick to your feet as you walked. So it actually made it easier to walk. But folks just stayed close to home, took care of the people that, got flooded out because they were in insufficient tents. The DJs still played, grilled cheese was still made and handed out, and everybody still had a good time. And just meant that some people needed to stay an extra couple days before vehicles could get out.
I actually heard stories from a handful of people, all of whom had been at Burning Man before, and that was the common refrain, was that it was like, it wasn't that big a deal. We just dealt with it. It was like, fine. No one wanted to leave, so it was not like we were stuck.
No, it
Yeah,
was all fine.
great. Is it fair for me to ask what might be coming up next for Miranda?
Yeah, it's fair for you to ask. I don't have like a good succinct answer yet. Like I already mentioned what I care about in this world, and that's supporting this community of small business and entrepreneurs. That will continue to be true. I keep coming up with ideas of like, oh, I could go build this SaaS company. And I don't think I'm going to build another SaaS company right now. That's not to say that in a year I might not have a different story, but
Are you going to end up with like a venture fund or as an
I,
angel or?
Yeah, I am doing. I am technically an angel now. I'm an LP in two funds, but I'm not spending a ton of time there. Valuations are such that at one point I was in a very different position financially than I am now. But I'm certainly, not for want of anything. But you'll probably see me writing and speaking more, and just trying to navigate and figure out how do I use my experiences and my voice to continue to serve this community. But exactly what that looks like, we'll have to wait and see.
All right. Usually, I've got a guest on the show that is looking to aggressively grow their business or is giving out marketing tips, etc. And so I ask them, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah.
Do you want to share that information? Should we include
Yes.
that in the show?
I,
Or
I
yes? Okay.
love
Well, then
people getting
how
in
can
touch with
people
me.
get in
Yeah.
touch with Miranda?
Yeah. Instagram is probably like, so Instagram, Miranda Lievers on Instagram, or mirandalievers.com. You can contact me through there too. I think that right now, one of the things that I'm most inspired by, as I said, are conversations, and in particular with scaling founders. So folks that, I think that there's lots of people out there that can help people go from like figure out how to start businesses. And so that's not something that, I can uniquely do. Lots of folks know how to start businesses, but there are fewer folks who have had a lot of experience with scale. So now that we've got something kind of off the ground, how do we grow it? How do we navigate all of that, the messy middle of scale and growth? And so if folks are feeling like they're in that place, I would love for them to reach out, because I love to have those conversations. It gives me insight into, as I think about how to serve that group of folks in an even better way, and maybe can help unlock a thing or two in a good conversation or interview. So by all means, reach out if that is you.
Great. Thank you very much, Miranda. I think that's the one of the things that you bring to this show that is so incredibly unique, is that insight of what it is to scale or to have scaled. I'm immensely grateful for having you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me. This has been a blast.